I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Leadership and Development, Strategic Negotiation Skills. It is my pleasure to introduce our featured presenter today, Executive Leadership Coach, Mr. Tom Brooks. Tom, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you for joining us, all of you. I really enjoy leading this subject, which is strategic negotiation skills. One of the things about the Center for Leadership and Development courses is that they all focus on different aspects of ourselves, of you, of the participants in the course. Everybody knows how to negotiate. If you have children, you know this very well. We learn how to negotiate instinctively. And yet through these courses and through working on ourselves in different ways, we're able to strengthen those things, those aspects of negotiation to make ourselves more successful and more intentional in our negotiating. And that's really what this course is about. So we're going to focus today on some of the language that we use around negotiation, and we're going to describe it to ourselves. So we're going to describe what we think about negotiation to become more effective as negotiators and more intentional. I think that's a very important word. So welcome and thank you for taking time out of your busy days to dedicate a little bit of time to this subject matter, which is extremely important. So thank you, and we'll go forward. So when we talk about strategic negotiation skills, we're talking basically about a kind of conversation. It's a kind of dialogue. It's a way in which we come into partnership with our counterparties, right? And we try and benefit from the different experiences and different perspectives that the two parties have to come to an agreement. In other words, one party should not thrive at the expense of another. Now, this may sound a little bit too soft for negotiating skills. In other words, it might sound like in this way, we're just coming to a collaborative agreement. No, we're talking about negotiation, and actually even very challenging, very hard negotiation has to be constructed on a kind of relationship that is based on mutual respect. And so one of the things we'll talk about today is how we can establish that kind of posture in which we invite the other party to express themselves clearly using clear language. So let's just go through this one more time. A negotiation is a constructive dialogue. It requires the art of conversation. It's a partnership in which the parties benefit from each other's experience and create added value between them. So I think it's really important that we concentrate on that idea of learning how to be better conversationalists, right? Learning how to be better negotiators. So if we don't have the skills and competencies strengthened, like I said, we know how to negotiate, we've been doing it all of our lives, and yet we need to strengthen those muscles in a way that's intentional. So it'll be difficult for us if we don't have the right skills and competencies. So I want each of us to think about what are the skills that are needed. This is not crush your opponent negotiation, right? This is a collaborative, I would say creative enterprise in which you develop solutions to problems that you have between you, right? Those problems could be of different nature, and yet you have to come together to some kind of agreement. That's what a negotiation is. So it arises because neither party will be able to get everything they want. And that's just clear. Otherwise, why enter into a negotiation? Knowing that there must be concessions, each party in the negotiation is required to adapt an attitude, I would say a posture of understanding, so that they need to get the best possible deal for themselves and for their constituents or for their stakeholders. But they need to understand that they need to do that in a way that's acceptable to the other party. Otherwise, it will be ineffective. And what we're talking about here in the Center for Leadership and Development courses is how to strengthen your ability to be an effective negotiator. An effective negotiator. And so what are some of the skills that we need? And I ask that to you. What are some of the skills that we need to be a successful negotiator? So just think about that for a minute. You know, what are the real characteristics? A lot of people would think it's about charisma or strength, or it actually turns out to be a much more interactive experience. When you've done difficult negotiations, my experience comes from the biotech, tech, and pharma world, in which you have on one side, in most cases, somebody who's invented something, right? So they have a deep visceral attachment to the value of that invention. And on the other side, you have a company, corporation, that is interested in taking benefit from that. Now you can see how that's already coming off from two different points of view, right? And so you really need to go through this is a very human enterprise, And to do that, you need all of these skills here. So you need to be an effective speaker. You need to speak with clarity, right? And you need to find well-prepared sentences to describe exactly your position so that you're understood. Sense of humor is fundamental. It's fundamental. All of those aspects of interaction, and that's why I focus on the idea that this is a kind of a conversation. It's the art of conversation. You need a sense of humor, you need a positive attitude, you need to show empathy and listening. For all of those same reasons, we think about instinctive negotiations. Think about yourself in an evolutionary context. So go back several 100,000, 1,000,000 years, and you're in the jungle and you have threat in front of you, right? All of your nerves, all of your resources are dedicated to understanding the profile of risk that you have in front of you. That's how interaction works between people. And it still works that way today. All of our alarms are going off to tell us what is our risk profile. To be an effective negotiator means establishing mutual respect, building on top of that a relationship, and then opening channels of communication in which neither side feels threatened. And therefore, empathy and listening is extremely important. Today, we'll go into the empathy and listening aspects of this only slightly. We have a limited amount of time. And yet I want to introduce these aspects of the interaction between the two sides as fundamental. Something that you should really take home from today's lesson is this idea that we are conversing with our counterparty based on mutual respect. We have to show, obviously, self-confidence. That self-confidence has to be established from a position of strength, and that position of strength comes not from power, external power, but from preparedness, from being prepared to negotiate, from knowing your stuff. And we'll talk more about how we prepare. Balance, equilibrium, understanding that the give and take is part of negotiation. Otherwise, it's not negotiation, right? If there's no give and take, there's no negotiation. Being realistic about what you can expect from your counterpart, what you can expect from the process as a whole. This kind of creativity takes place especially towards the end of the negotiating part or towards the end of the bargaining phase of the negotiation part, in which you're looking creatively at the subject matter and you're doing it in a way that invites creative energy to come up with new solutions. What if, right? Answering the what if question. So if you come to loggerheads, as they call it, and you're not getting any progress, finding a creative solution, stepping out of your perspective, stepping out of your frame, and finding a creative way of establishing new room for movement in the bargaining. Hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more about that. Emotional intelligence, just broadly, and this is a full field of study on its own, but just broadly, emotional intelligence is understanding that there are emotional forces that are reactions that are happening within us, taking note of them, but allowing ourselves to slow down and let our brain get involved. In other words, the emotional intelligence signals, the emotional signals are happening immediately. We need to have the emotional intelligence to recognize that it's happening, understand them, question ourselves, what's that? Why am I feeling that way? And then get our brain involved and say, well, what do you think about what's happening in your emotion, in your gut? So let your gut slow down long enough to listen to your brain and then come out with a pondered response. So when we talk about using or applying these skills, we talk very, very clearly about preparation, but also about the context in which we negotiate. Remember, you need to prepare yourself personally because negotiating can be quite scary, right? It can be an intense emotional experience because you really do have, for example, on your shoulders, the expectations of your stakeholders and your team, right? And so it is a sense in which you can feel very tense. And I'm not arguing that it's easy, but I am arguing that if you prepare well, especially personally, we've broken preparation down into the personal preparation, your own coaching that you do with yourself, and the coaching that you do on the subject matter. Those two things are separated. We need to really think about how we're interacting. So as long as you understand your position, and that's knowing your stuff, that gives you some strength. It strengthens your spine. It gives you a better posture, right? So as long as you know your position, there's no danger that you will lose a negotiation. It's a creative process. The negotiation creates something that would not have happened if you hadn't entered into the negotiation. Even a bad negotiation produces some know-how, some understanding, some interaction. So during and before negotiation, you should always be polite. This is not crush your opponent. This is engage with another party to find solutions to problems that you couldn't solve by yourselves. Being polite, being respectful, never reduces your argument. It never diminishes your argument to be polite. Being firm. Where does that position of firm come from? It comes from a posture of knowing your thing. No, you've studied, you've prepared. But it also comes from other aspects that we'll talk about as we go forward. Calmness facilitates persuasion and compromise. So a sense of calm, in other words, a sense of we're working together on this, and I don't need to immediately respond with my most visceral or instinctive response, but I can take the time, listen to my gut, but also listen to my brain. I hope that's clear for everybody in the room, that what we're talking about is a collaborative effort between what is clearly an emotional situation. In other words, I'm engaging on behalf of maybe my company or maybe my team or maybe my family or my community in a negotiation in which things matter, right? And yet I'm able to establish myself in this posture of calm because that's the best way to get this done. And I do that through a posture of ponderance. In other words, taking a second. It may only take a millisecond. Taking a millisecond to let my brain get engaged, come up with a response that makes sense, right? And then expressing that response using clear language. And this last point is really important. Now, it's not possible to totally detach ourselves from the subject matter, right? We can't totally detach the emotional way that we feel about it because we aren't, then there's no reason for us to be in the room. If we don't care, right, there's no reason for us to be in the room. And that will also be perceived by our counterpart. Remember that our counterpart perceives everything that's going on, right? They perceive. So we are taking on a position of strength, but we also have to show that we do care, right? But that's different from taking things personally. So let me try and demonstrate that. If we think about a new posture, a new positioning of ourselves with respect to the subject matter, we want to make sure that it's externalized, right? We take it outside of ourselves. So if this is the subject matter, right? I'm able to take this out and look at it. I'm able to then invite the counterpart to describe what they see. Now, clearly, if the counterpart perceives this way, that's different, right? And I'm going to need to not take that personally. I'm going to need to not attach myself so viscerally to the subject matter that I say I disagree with your point of view. I need to be able to suspend my point of view long enough to accept other descriptions. Now, what happens is we start to describe from different points of view this subject matter. Is that clear? So by getting more and more detail from different points of view, we get a better description of what we're discussing or what we're negotiating. And I'm not taking it personally because I've put a little bit of sunlight between myself and the subject matter. Knowing your own personal boundaries needs to happen before you go into the negotiations. Clearly, if you go into negotiations with a vague understanding of your ideas, that's perceived as weakness. And by definition, they will then go and look for those points as points that they can have an advantage over you on because you're vague. So don't get pushed into a deal in which it's unsatisfactory to you because you didn't prepare for the negotiation based on your own personal boundaries. Your own personal boundaries. What am I not going to concede? And what am I willing to discuss and concede? Now, some of that will shift during the negotiation, but there are some red lines out of which you will not step in that negotiation. And if they do, get pushed enough, you may decide to say, look, we're not going to talk about that. This is a round of negotiation, and we will go to the next round with that subject matter, maybe, right? But take it off the table. Okay. In preparing our position, we also are preparing ourselves for the negotiation. We also want to think about our position with respect to our stakeholders. So does anybody know what the WHOP, BATNA, and WHOP are? I think you can just raise your hands, but in any event, think about that. If there are people who know what the WHOP and the BATNA and the WHOP are, those are things you need to prepare for together with your stakeholders, right? Together with your team, and make sure that they are firm and well understood before you go into the negotiation. And in doing so, you establish a mandate. In other words, it's clear and unambiguous what the expectations are for you when you go in, so that you don't feel like the pressure on your team is also, not just because they're relying on you, but they're relying on you with expectations that haven't been discussed, that aren't clear, right? So don't set yourself up for failure by not doing the homework, the preparative work before the negotiation, to establish a mandate from your team, to establish the expectations for success. How will we measure the success? All right, well, let's look at these WHATNA, BATNA, and WHOP and what they are and how we can use them to our benefit. So we're trying now, remember, we're in the beginning, we're in the preparation for our negotiation. So we're trying now to establish what are the boundaries of our negotiation. And to do that, we say, what is the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement? So what's the worst thing that could happen if we don't get an agreement? And then what's the best alternative to negotiated agreement? Can you see how those two frame a kind of condition in which, when I go into my negotiation, I know what's the worst that can happen to me and the best that can happen to me if we don't make an agreement, right? And that's a strong position to go into. That's a strong position to go into. It sort of says, okay, if everything goes wrong in this negotiation and we don't get any of the points that we wanted and we don't agree on any, I know already crystal clear, and my stakeholders know what the worst and best alternatives are. And by having that really, really strongly in my mind, I'm a better negotiator because I negotiate from a position of strength, which is perceived by my counterpart. Okay, let's go forward. I know those are acronyms, and acronyms can be confusing, and there are a lot of them around the negotiating field. As I'm sure you all know, there are a lot of books. You know, you go to an airport bookstore, you'll find a lot of books on how to win at negotiating. These two acronyms, however, do define an idea that I think is useful to anybody who's going to enter into a negotiation. So how likely a particular outcome will be. If your WHATNA, the worst alternative, is something that would be difficult for you to accept, but the likelihood is small, then you don't feel so compelled to give up much in negotiations. Can you see how that would work? I've decided that it is bad, right? It is a bad alternative, and yet it's unlikely to happen. And so when I go in, I still have some strength in my position, and I won't give up so much. I won't give up so much of the smaller points, I'd say. Consider both best case scenarios and worst case scenarios. Make sure that you're being realistic. How you feel about the WHATNA dictates how flexible you are when you enter the negotiations. So I've set myself up with a WHATNA that's clear, that I understand. I've thought about it with respect to the BATNA, and now I go into the negotiation with a sense of how much I'm willing to move. Movement is essential, or else it's not a negotiation, but how much am I going to move? How flexible am I going to be? The alternative, in the case of the best alternative, is actually more important than the WHATNA. If it's unthinkable that you might have a negotiating agreement, then it's very difficult. It's very challenging to go in thinking there is no world in which a negotiation settlement doesn't happen. This is our only choice. This is our last chance. It's really important that you come up with a satisfactory BATNA, right? A satisfactory WHATNA, so that you know that there is, yes, possibility and potential in making this effort. It's an investment in negotiation, but you also know that the world exists without that negotiation, and you've defined that world to develop your strength. Once you're in the negotiation, you arrive at your WHOP, right? Now, many people think about this in terms of the fixed pie negotiation, right? The used car, or actually the new car in a car lot. They know what that walkaway price means in terms of a negotiation for something that has a real clear value. I'm going to buy this car at this price, right? And yet you still have that sort of uneasy feeling when you're driving away from the dealership and you've got these car mats, you know, these floor mats, and you think, oh, I just really nailed that. And you're like, maybe I didn't nail it, right? The walkaway price is really important for defining within yourself that position from which you won't move, right? You need to go in with that kind of strength, because if you're communicating also with your counterparty that you're moving all the time, that you're not fixed, That makes things very uneasy. It also shows a weakness on your part, but it also indicates that the negotiation itself isn't well prepared, right? If the other party knows or has an idea of your WHOP, then it stops being your WHOP, right? That's just your price. Think about that for a second. You get that, right? So if I know what your walkaway price is, that's not a walkaway price. That's your price, and I know that's where you'll go. So make sure you keep it in your mind. It's secret in your negotiations. And in this case, we're talking about a price, right? But what I intend by this mechanism is more subtle than that. There may be a WHOP for every item on our agenda. There might be a WHOP for every item on our agenda, and we've now established these boundaries. We've established this fixed price, and it gives us the strength to enter the bargaining stage of the negotiation, knowing what the limits are, but still allowing enough movement. So I'm sure you can all see why it's important to stick to your plan. Once you've set it, you have to stick to it. It's a meaningless price if you're not prepared to walk away if it's not met. In other words, you erode all of the meaning out of this preparation and also out of this walk-away price if, as soon as they push on you, you walk away from it. You move, you say, okay, I'll accept that. Make sure you give the impression to opponents in negotiation that you could walk away at any time. Now, understand that the dynamics, and we'll talk a little bit about setting these meetings up, but the dynamics of a negotiation vary quite a bit, but it should be clear that both sides have an exit, right? Both sides have an exit. They can leave at any time. There's a lot of theory, let's say, about how you should trick your counterparts by increasing the heat in the room, giving them lots to drink, and not having an easy access to it, but whatever. Those tricks, tips and tricks are ineffective. We're talking now about the opposite of that. So if you're in charge or you've been given the power to set the time and the place together with them, but to actually set it up, the most comfortable sort of conscious setup is actually a good way for you to garner goodwill from the other side. And garnering goodwill is one of the key factors in creating movement in your bargaining, right? So you want to make sure that they're comfortable. You want to make sure that you take breaks at the right time, that there's oxygen in the room, right? That if things are slowing down, you might take a break, open the room, let the air in, make sure that they have refreshments. If they're on a different time zone, make sure that you respect that. All of those things that make them physically, humanly in the best position to negotiate shows also your position of strength. I hope you can see that. If I set it up so that I'm putting you at a disadvantage sort of logistically, right, that's not going to be perceived as strength on my part. That'll be perceived as weakness. Instead, if I set it up so that the conditions are ideal for a creative process, everybody has what they need to feel comfortable and to actually think and be clear-headed, I'm showing strength. We talked a little bit about framing and about the perspective, right? Take the subject matter, you externalize it, and then you invite people to provide their input. In a creative process, the more the better, right? While it's open, while you're open to discussion, as much detail from as many perspectives is important. Understand that negotiating framework from them is how they see what's going on. You have to agree to the common language about the subject matter. Each term needs to be understood, and that may require back and forth. That may require some serious back and forth. These are the terms that we're discussing in this negotiation, and this is how I perceive them. How do you perceive them? And then echo that back, right? Say it back. Those are flags to plant, because that's really important that you understand that they see it from that point of view. That will help you in a very powerful way if, for example, they're stuck on something. And you'll remember, they see this differently than I do. This is how. Of course, what's on the table and what isn't on the table is an extremely vital aspect of the preparation of the meeting. So before you start your negotiations, agree on what's up for discussion and what isn't. Non-negotiable issues taken off the negotiating table at the outset. Sometimes people will repeat during the negotiation the non-negotiable issues that you've already taken off the table. and just remind them that those have been taken off the table and we're not discussing them. Bring the focus back to those things that you can actually change. Maintaining a positive framework, right? Maintaining sort of a respect, a genuine respect, a genuine curiosity about how they see what you're talking about. I am genuinely curious to know how you see this, why it's important for you. And I hope that you will be genuinely curious as to how I see these points. And when I express them to you, I expect that based on our mutual respect and the relationship that we're establishing, and by the way, let's remember our relationships, especially in the business world, may far exceed the time in our current positions. We may meet again in another negotiation. Those relationships are fundamental. And actually, having lived through, let's say it like that, lived through or survived a difficult negotiation is actually a really serious and strong bond that can be formed in a business relationship. Okay, it's important to set a positive framework, a framework that shows possibility, right? That's open. Let's look at the five steps that we've identified at the Center for Leadership and Development in this course, which takes a position that negotiation, especially in the business world, to be effective needs to be creative. To be effective needs to be a collaborative, creative process that creates something that could not have been created without the other party. That's a really important sort of distinction between the art of the deal, let's say, in which the idea is that you go and you crush. Now, just a brief pause on that before we do the process. What's the disadvantage of using external power as a negotiating tool? What's the disadvantage? You think about it in terms of international diplomacy. If I use my military might or my industrial power, it may be effective, but it's not sustainable. Now, why is it not sustainable? You might argue, well, in diplomacy, it certainly has been sustainable. It has been, and yet the most sustainable relationships have survived all of the ups and downs. And the reason is this: if I base my negotiation on power in primis, external power, external meaning external to the negotiating subject matter that we're talking about, any change in that power dynamic, whether that power dynamic goes up or down, it doesn't matter. Any change will cause questioning to the whole structure. I've forced you into a deal using power. I may gain more power, I may gain less power in the future, but you will question that deal. Instead, if I establish a positive, creative, constructive outcome, that's sustainable because all of those conditions will still be there. The relationship will still be there. Okay. Apart from that little digression on the idea of power, let's look at the 5-step process. So preparation, we talked a good deal already about preparation. We'll talk now about the opening position, how we state our opening position, and how that then transforms into the bargaining phase. Bargaining is when you're going back and forth, and we've all experienced that in different degrees. So you'll observe it at home if you have kids. You'll observe it in all sorts of different characteristics in all sorts of different parts of your lives. But that bargaining phase, once it's opened, goes until there's no more movement, right? And so that movement phase is when you're starting to actually make concessions, you're actually asking for concessions, you're going back and forth. You plant your flags when movement has ceased. In other words, you've stopped making progress on any of these points that you've identified. There's no more progress, so there's no more movement. Everybody's pretty much fixed. And so before it becomes frustrating and angry and ineffective, plant flags in each of those successes that you've had, reiterate those non-successes, so reiterate them for clarity, and then close. And the closure states the outcome and may invite a second round or a third round or a fourth round, or may invite something else, may invite another analysis, or may set up a kind of an algorithm for future negotiation. In that algorithm, we might say, should this happen, then we will re-enter into negotiations. But you've opened and closed this conversation. It's really important that we see that a negotiation has its process and it closes. You can't jump from one section to the other, but you also can't just leave it open. You can't just leave this conversation open forever. You have to have a round. And that is one of the things that from the outside seems quite bizarre about international diplomacy, that we have these rounds, we make some progress, and we have another round, because you really can only achieve so much in a single negotiated process. Okay. So engage in a little small talk. I mean, I don't need to tell you guys that. It's a human interaction. We're talking about human beings on both sides of the table. Get off on the right foot by starting conversations that are on a human level. And why do we do that? Well, it's the same thing we were talking about being in the jungle and understanding our risk portfolio, our risk profile. The more I understand that the two parties are human, that they have lives outside of the negotiation, that we have things in common, the stronger that first level is of humanity. That's first level of mutual respect. This is where you establish it. I don't know if any of you remember the cartoon in which the sheepdog is protecting the sheep and the wolf or the coyote is, and the coyote and the sheepdog, sign out, and when they sign out of their jobs at the end of the workday, right, they're buddies. It's kind of the same thing here. I mean, we're willing to engage with seriousness and with strength, and we're willing to actually confront difficult issues together. But we're doing it because we have a solid basis. And that solid basis starts with good human relationship, right? And you can establish that relatively quickly, as long as you're in the right sort of frame of mind. We mentioned not sharing your walkaway price. You don't want to give too much information about your position on each issue, because you're not in the negotiated or bargaining state. And sometimes people will attempt that. In other words, as you're walking towards the negotiation room, they might try and get your opinion on certain pieces, and just kind of keep that off the table until it's on the table. I hope that's clear, because that's a really important point. You don't start the actual bargaining until you've done your opening and you've stated your cases and you've organized it, because it's actually going to erode your position if they know more than you have. So there it is, a suggestion from us. That's an important question. Before we get to it, let's make sure we agree on the issues that we're discussing. So let's frame it first, right? Let's frame our discussion. Let's make sure that everybody understands how we see these things. Agree on the topics. Understand your common ground, right? Understand what you have in common. Understand what drives them, what drives you. Prepare a way for both parties to recognize they will not complete negotiations without some movement on some issues. You also don't want to be perceived as secretive, right? It's important not to give away your position, or at least not until you're ready to. Let's get a few general issues settled before we get into the specifics. Start negotiations, both parties will to some extent be on the defensive. Of course, it's an uncomfortable, we're about to do something uncomfortable in which we give things away, right? And we ask for others. So of course, at the beginning, things will be closed and somewhat rigid. And that's another reason why we don't start bargaining until we're actually in the bargaining phase. I'm going through this a little bit too fast, but if you think about it, the impasse is something that we've all experienced, in which two positions are just very, very hard and not moving. So let's look at some of the suggestions you can have for how to break those. In other words, they're sort of fixed, encrusted, they're engaged. It's difficult to pull them apart, and you may or may not be able to, but here are some of the suggestions. If there's money, change the terms. Change the terms of the payment. In other words, if you're talking about money, say, okay, well, let's change it to you pay me every quarter. You may perceive that the problem that they have is fiscal. In other words, they don't want to pay you within this fiscal year, they want to pay you half and half. Okay, change the terms. It could be that there's animosity. It could be that a relationship is not healthy, or it could be that it's time to just change a member of the team. Agree on that. That can happen. All of these things, though, all of these things we're mentioning require an agility, a creativity, an openness to finding solutions. Can you see that? Can you see how we're getting to a position in which we're talking now about, we're actually talking about being collaborative and finding new solutions. Agree on the easy issues. So get some of those concessions out to make movement happen. Well, they already agreed on 4 or 5 items. Tick, 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 tick. That creates real momentum. Momentum is important. If you have to, change the list of options being considered. If you need to, adjourn. Could be a period of time, could be a month, could be an hour. But if you're stuck, there's no reason to damage your relationships by continuing to go like this. If you're stuck, You can say, let's adjourn, right? Let's plant the flags that we've achieved, if we have any, and let's adjourn, and then come back with other options. You might need more information. In that case, you go back out and you get more information. Okay. We look at positional bargaining from 3 different sort of points of view, and these are all real. So when I say we need to be collaborative and creative, I'm not saying this is a touchy-feely love 1960s, everybody's, we're all friends here kind of thing. You still have to take your position seriously, and they do as well. So I'm going to put these into context with these 3 different positional bargaining stances, their postures. So one is hard, the hard posture. The participants are adversaries. The goal is victory. There's no trust. We're hard on the people and the problem. In other words, we're pushing the people and we're pushing the problem. We stick to our position and we don't move. We hide the bottom line. We hide everything. We demand concessions. We demand the one solution. Anybody think of what a negotiation without concessions is? What's the name for a negotiation without concessions? It's anything but not a negotiation. If there are no concessions, it's an email. It's a letter saying, this is what I want. Do this. That's not a negotiation. Demanding a solution, a single solution that you already have in mind, is not a negotiation. Soft. Positional bargaining, when you're talking about a soft positional bargaining, is that you're moving quite a bit. You state what the conditions are. You state what the needs are. You show, I'm wearing my heart on my sleeve. I'm showing you what I need. We search for one solution, but we're searching, and we all make concessions. In between those two is this common understanding, and I find that to be the most effective and the most sustainable. In other words, the solutions that come out of a common positional bargaining negotiation, that was a lot of words in one sentence, but a solution that results from that kind of common positional bargaining is more sustainable. It will last longer. The results will last longer and will probably produce greater results for both parties. So in positional bargaining, we're problem solvers. We try and find an outcome that's going to satisfy both, the win-win, as you would call it. We treat trust and distrust as irrelevant to the issue. We're soft on the people and hard on the problem. In other words, I have full respect for you. I understand who you are and where you're coming from, and I respect you as a human. However, and then you get into the really hard, really challenging job of describing the subject matter from your point of view, suspending your point of view, accepting theirs, and going back and forth until you get a clear picture of what this is, such that it's evident to both parties what the solution is. Real creative brainstorming works like that, right? You work on these, you throw these ideas out until you get a solution that works perfectly and everybody recognizes it. Okay, you focus on interests and not positions. You focus on the interests of the parties and not on their positions. There is no bottom line. You create new options for mutual gain. And you develop multiple options. You develop more choices. Find new choices. Focus on the interests and not the positions. So we brainstorm. Here are some examples. It's very similar to the examples of breaking the impasse. You can see that. How can I expand the pie, right? How can I come up with new ways of seeing this problem? What are the key core values that both sides are expressing that can be met? Now I'm going to change the scope of the negotiation, because if, for example, we are unable to achieve that huge overarching success win-win for both, because there just is an incompatibility, we can make it smaller, right? We can make that scope smaller. That may call out a second round or a third round. And that's when you identify those issues that can be set aside. You don't know your outcome until you negotiate. Is that clear? You don't know where you're going to be going. And so some of the things you put on your list, you may not get there. You may not get there. Okay. So one of the problems that arises in negotiations is the parties feel like they're being marginalized. I feel like I'm outside of this. I can't make control. I can't get what I want. I'm in constant opposition and we're moving slowly. So how do I develop this sense of consensus, this sense of commonality, rather than putting people in the corner in opposition to each other? The idea, sorry to keep picking this up, the idea is that we hold this subject matter out. Now, I've been describing it. They see it like this, I see it like this, and we talk about it. And we invite others to come in and talk about it. Hey, what do you see? Well, I see it like this. Okay, and what do you see? And how can we discuss it? And we're getting a clearer picture. Okay, but what am I doing here? Now think about it. I don't know where you guys, maybe you're sitting down, whatever. Think about yourself standing up on your feet and not being face to face with your adversary, but being instead shoulder to shoulder. You see how that's different? Let's just invite my counterpart on the other side of the table to stand shoulder to shoulder with me and look at the subject matter and tell me what they see. That invitation to share in the experience of looking at the subject matter, watching the ship pass on the river together, is fundamentally more productive and creative than the face-to-face adversarial approach. If we want to come up with a mutual gain solution, we need to understand the two parties. We need to understand that they both have positions that are valid, right? And whether we agree or disagree is irrelevant. They have that point of view. Negotiations aren't for convincing people of your world, right? They're for coming up with a commonality, a consensus. Okay, that's a lot for one slide. I hope that that's clear. The idea though is that it is distinctive from the adversarial approach of crush your opponent, win at all costs. So how do you do that, right? I mean, it's one thing to invite them shoulder to shoulder, let's look at that, but how do you actually do it? Well, one of the things you have to do is you have to agree on and express to each other your wants and your needs. So how do you do that? You come up with a list of the things that you want and the things that you need. And you invite them to share their wants and their needs. Is that a must-have or a nice-to-have? Can I get some movement on that? Are you willing to discuss this? And I start to show my interest in sharing with them also my distinction between wants and needs. And you will find some compatibilities there. And once you've found the compatibilities, you'll come up with agreements. Sometimes it's good to make, as I said at the outset, to make a concession on a relatively small area, make a few concessions, share a little bit more information to get things moving and to show movement. Because as soon as the movement ceases, that round of negotiation basically stops. So as much movement as you get for as long as you can sustain it, and then lock it down before it gets hostile, and plant your flags. This is what we agreed in. How do you plant your flags? Well, you finalize the terms of agreement. An agreement, to be successful, must have clearly stated, unambiguous terms. Because it's so easy. It's so easy. The expectations are so high that when you get back to the office and everybody's like, well, did you win? Right? And you're like, it's not about winning. Okay, take this course. Take this course. It's not about winning, I promise. And they ask you, have you won? Did you win on this issue, this issue, this issue? If it's not clear, the pressure will be extremely high to have those terms sort of become more and more vague. You have to do that clear, echoing writing during the negotiated phase while you're negotiating. So what was agreed on to during the negotiation needs to be translated into how in the terms of an agreement, and that document has to be written out, it has to be fixed. Now you might say that the negotiators then step back and let people actually make that document who are better at writing documents. That may be the case, but the intention has to be fixed while the negotiation is at its absolute activity, right? If we don't plant our flags during it, then our position will be different when we get home. I hope that's clear, that last. Finalizing the terms of agreement is the thing that nails the terms. And if you don't do it right away, you'll set up an agreement that is ambivalent or ambiguous, and that will cause all sorts of tension and confusion. The level of detail reflects the scope of the negotiation, the complexity and the risk inherent in the agreement that you're establishing. So if it's a simple sort of straightforward, I'd like to have a road that goes to my garage. That's pretty clear. If it's more complex, you need to use that level of detail. You may need professionals to write that document. Okay, and the professionals are called in for any applicable legal and regulatory compliance. Now, I recognize that I went very quickly through only a piece of the Center for Leadership and Development course on strategic negotiation skills. It's a subject matter that I find fascinating, and you can always get better at negotiating, and it applies not just to your business life, but to your personal life as well. And so thank you. Pass the mic back over to Kelly for any questions that you guys have, and I'm here and available.
Thank you so much, Tom. If you guys have any questions for Tom, please feel free to type those in now, and we will go ahead and address those over audio in just a minute. I just want to remind you all that this session is being recorded. You will all receive the recording link by tomorrow morning to review, or you can pass on to any colleagues who were unable to join us. I also want to remind you all that as you log off, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. So if you could take the next, it's about a 30-second survey. It shouldn't take you too long. So please feel free to fill that out as well. I do see a few questions already on, is it possible to get a copy of the presentation? Yes, definitely. Just type your email into the questions and I will send you all a copy of the presentation as well. Okay, Tom, so someone had a question on how to, could you please do a quick recap of the BATNA?
Sure. The best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So the idea is that if I don't succeed in my negotiation, or even I don't enter into my negotiation, what is my best alternative? So let's say you're in a situation in which maybe a situation, let's say a financial situation in which the stakes are high. Either I get somebody to invest in this, right, or I don't. And if I don't, my opinion or my sensation is there is no alternative. Before I enter into that negotiation, I need to establish, in any event, the world goes forward, right? In any event, that might not be my preferred solution, might be a negotiated one. But in the absence of a negotiated agreement, what do I think is my best alternative? Is that clear? So what is the best thing that could happen if I don't negotiate? And the same is true. What is the worst thing that could happen if I don't negotiate? That frames your mind. It sort of strengthens your spine when you go into the negotiation because you know what you're risking, right? And you have to be really honest with yourself about those two alternatives because they define the strength with which you approach the negotiation, and that's perceived by your counterpart.
All right, and can you explain more about what you mean by trust and distrust are irrelevant?
So it's more about, so when we focus, if we focus on our I trust you, I don't trust you, once we've established a negotiation sort of milieu or framework, whether I have to take on face value everything that you're saying on a human level, right? It's irrelevant to me whether I actually trust you as a person. Now, of course, it feels uncomfortable to negotiate with somebody with whom you don't trust, but you're still nailing down things, nailing down topics within the framework of a negotiated settlement. And so they will be held to those things. They will be held to those whether or not you trust them. So if you think about the trust on the whole negotiated settlement, that has to be present. But the individual trust and distrust is irrelevant. Is that clear? So what I think about that person's trustworthiness is different from what I think about the trustworthiness of the negotiation. The negotiation, if we don't have trust, we can't start it. We can't even begin it. But it's irrelevant whether I trust that person individually.
All right, we do have another question. Hold on one second, trying to find where I just lost it. Give me 1 second.
Okay, no problem. In the meantime, if people are logging off, if you go to that survey, you'll get questions about whether or not you negotiate in your daily lives. And I think one of the things we should reflect on how often we actually do negotiate just in our regular interactions with people in our families, in our communities, and at work, and how basically negotiating requires an adult to adult posture, right? This kind of transactional posture in which I speak as an adult and I expect you to speak as an adult. And one of the other courses that we work on in emotional intelligence in the Center for Leadership and Development focuses really on that, on how can you elevate sort of people from a childish perspective into an adult one, and how can you sort of move down from a parenting perspective into an adult perspective. And that's really fundamental for negotiation as well. And so when we talk about trust and distrust, I want to make sure that we understand that we do still require adult behavior from both sides of the table. And adult behavior includes also things like saying what you mean. Okay.
How do, sorry, real quick, how do negotiation and mediation differ?
So negotiation comes to a specific settlement. Mediation looks at a problem, and so negotiation can have a range of topics, and you come to a specific understanding of each one. A mediation is when there is a conflict, an intrinsic conflict, and you act as a third party, as a mediator. You listen to and sort of echo back, and it basically helps triangulate this perspective that I was talking about. Mediation is different from negotiation in that you're not taking two positions that already exist and trying to pull them apart. That's mediation, right? Trying to understand why they're not going to court. There is negotiation involved in mediation for sure, but mediation is really about sort of being the third party. Mediation is about being the third party, about being an outside perspective. And negotiation is not an outside perspective, it's internal, it's the two parties. There could be more parties in a negotiation, but you know what I mean. The parties are intrinsic. There isn't an external point of view saying, this is how I see what you guys are dealing with. And since I'm outside of it, I have a better perspective. I'm less biased.
All right. And will the role of negotiation be diminished by the use of artificial intelligence and the implementation of algorithms in establishing requirements to an agreement?
Sure. Well, if you think about just the short answer is humans will negotiate no matter what when they interact with each other. If they do that through the tools, if they're facilitating that through the tools of algorithm, or the number of negotiations is reduced, that's quite possible. Algorithm, however, has to be based on something that is already predetermined. And I think if you look at the disruption in the space of smart contracts and, let's say, smart ledger, that has nothing to do with artificial intelligence, and yet it's a computer-powered solution, right? It's a computer-powered solution in which all of the chains of that agreement are unambiguous. Now, if technology can help us be clear, that blockchain is a perfect example of that. In other words, there is less ambiguity on the line in that contract. The contract is established faster and is less ambiguous. That's great. In terms of artificial intelligence and sort of fuzzy logic, I don't know enough to give you a good answer. My guess would be yes. In other words, my guess would be that we will get better at negotiating if we have partners who are, we have algorithms who are also our partners in establishing solutions that are win-win. Why not? Why not use the wet brain, which is ours, and the dry brain, which is a computer, and coming up with new forms, let's say, of collaboration. I'm totally open to that. There will remain the art of the conversation, and there will remain the art of the negotiation, but the computer can participate as well.
All right. And how much of this negotiation process would you say goes into a manager and employee relationship?
Well, I mean, if you think about it, if you're going in for your quarterly review and there's a bonus on the table, you need to be prepared. You need to be prepared, and the same is true if you're the manager and you're trying to encourage a person who works for you to be more productive, and you want to do that through a negotiation in which you give up something and they give up something. That's a negotiation. So absolutely, those are the skills. We formalize it in this course, the Center for Development. We formalize it to the extent that we need to make it clear that it's a process that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, that you need to prepare for it and work through it and come to a conclusion. But we don't want to over-formalize it and say that these things don't happen when our kid asks for the keys to the car, right? They also happen in manager and employee. And leadership skills, like leadership communication, are also involved with not just motivation, but also negotiation. And we negotiate with the people that we work with, on a daily basis, in a much more lightweight version of what I gave you guys in today's talk. I hope that's clear. The answer is yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yes, thank you, Tom. That's going to go ahead and wrap up today's webinar session. So, Tom, thank you so much for joining us and
Thank
speaking
you
on behalf
guys.
of New Horizons.
Great.
And
And thank
thank
you guys
you.
for participating.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone, for joining us on today's session. You will receive a recording link tomorrow, and then I will get that PowerPoint presentation to everyone who listed their email address in the questions. So thank you so much. You may now log off. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye. Thank you.